Hi, I'm Vas Bednar. I'm the host of Lately, but today we're bringing you an episode of one of our sister shows here at the Globe and Mail. It's called Machines Like Us. They're a technology show about people, so they've done episodes on things like AI companions and loneliness. I found that one really heartfelt and fascinating. There's also an episode on the future of war. Today, though, we're playing an episode that's all about Silicon Valley's shift to the right and its role in the upcoming U.S. election. The show is hosted by Taylor Owen, and the feed is yours, Taylor.
Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. Does a Canadian tech show really need to cover the US election? Normally, I'd say probably not. But, and I know we always say this isn't a normal election. For one thing, the tech industry seems to be exerting its influence in ways that we haven't seen before. Elon Musk has gone from occasional online troll to Trump's wealthiest and loudest backer. He's been called MAGA's Minister of Propaganda. The crypto lobby now accounts for almost half of all corporate donations this election. And for the first time, the once reliably blue Silicon Valley seems to be shifting to the right. To help us better understand this moment, I'm joined by three journalists. Natasha Tiku is a tech culture reporter at The Washington Post. Charlie Wiesel is a staff writer for The Atlantic. And Charles Duhigg is the author of a recent piece in The New Yorker called Silicon Valley, the New Lobbying Monster. His latest book is Super Communicators. Together, these are three of the most prominent tech writers in the US. And I wanted to have them on, not just to help me understand the American election, but to try to unpack what this might mean for our own election as well, and for the state of democracy around the world. I wanted to start with just a quick round around all of you and what do you each think is the biggest tech story of this election? What have you taken from this last year? Natasha, why don't you go first?
I would say the biggest story, perhaps like an underlying current that's influenced a lot of different stories, is this, what I would call like a masks off moment in Silicon Valley, related to what often is manifested as like a rightward or conservative turn. But you really saw during the last, let's say like during Trump's first administration, during like the episodes of seeing Mark Zuckerberg in Congress, and then also during the George Floyd protests, tech CEOs, executives, venture capitalists felt really pressured to do things like gesture towards diversity, to listen to their employees when they were protesting. And I think we saw, as the pandemic went on, that there was a lot of resentment towards that and to the way that they were characterized in the media as well. And I would say, that's partly what motivated Elon Musk to buy Twitter. And I think the move since then to build their own media pipelines, so that when you're endorsing Trump, you are not taking critical questions from the media. You're not even taking really any questions. You're doing it on your podcast or a podcast with a very friendly host. And you feel really unburdened, I think, from the expectations that were on tech executives during the prior decade. And I think that has also led to the narrative that these tech elites are trying to push around techno optimism and, kind of taking back what they see as this like persecution of tech or villainizing of tech, making their life's work sound small or inconsequential and
or threatening democracy, whatever the case may be. Either not good or very, very bad. And I think that really undergirds a lot of the political shift that we've seen. It enabled it. Charles, what from your perspective, biggest tech story of the year?
Yeah, I think to build on what Natasha was just saying, I think there's actually two things that stand out to me. The first is the realization within the Valley that there is no party that is necessarily their home. For a long time, the Valley was aligned with the Democrats, and there's still overwhelmingly the Valley will vote Democratic. But there is widespread, it's a strong word to use, but widespread hatred of Joe Biden within the tech industry because of the folks that he's appointed to the FTC and to the antitrust and the DOJ and to the SEC. And it feels like to many within the Valley that there's been a real betrayal of this enthusiasm that they had for the Democrats and for Pax Obama, that went back when tech was cool. And then I think the second thing that's happened is that to accompany that is this realization, this almost coming of age of the tech industry, realizing the power and the clout that they have and starting to wield it. 50% of corporate donations in this cycle have been from the cryptocurrency industry. That's a lot of money that they're spending. They essentially have blown up a couple of candidates who had a chance of winning simply because they weren't even necessarily anti-crypto. They just weren't sufficiently friendly towards crypto. And the tech industry as a whole has become, depending on how you count it, either the largest or among the largest corporate special interest groups. And they now know how to use that clout and use that influence to get what they want.
Charlie, what's your take?
What strikes me in this election with the way it's interacted with technology and the internet and all those ways, it's to me, it's just like a deepening of trends that have been existing for a long period of time. There's obviously a lot of new stuff and the Elon Musk of it all, and like if you look at Facebook, or I guess Meta's posture towards content moderation in this election, it's sort of a hands-off now moment after.
I mean, that's a huge change from last election, right? Where like content moderation was a big part of the election.
Yeah, I think there's, broadly speaking to that trend in Silicon Valley, at least what I seem to notice is this idea of a lot of CEOs looking around and saying, well, I guess we all kind of freaked out during the pandemic, right? Like we all sort of regret coming together and trying to stop the flood of a lot of false information. We feel like maybe we went too far. But I just see a deepening of a lot of trends that we've been seeing when we're talking about, the flood of false information across the internet, right? The increase in crap that you see, generative AI stuff. I mean, a lot of that is being used essentially to help illustrate and act as, propaganda to serve narratives of things that didn't happen. And I think there's this, this broad idea of, well, it doesn't really matter if it's real or not. It feels real, right? It represents something that is truer than true. And I think that is sort of an acceleration of trends that we were seeing before. And it feels like it's really picking up. You saw it with the hurricanes and all.
Yeah, let me pick up on that, because you recently wrote an article about that maybe got caught in some of the dynamics of the right-wing media ecosystem that we're talking about here. And can you describe what was your argument there, and how did you get caught almost in that very same thing you were describing?
Yeah, I think, the article was born of this pretty wild to see phenomenon of attacks against meteorologists, against, disaster management agencies who are trying to come in and help, and all these conspiracies, fomenting and being spread on the right about that. But, you see the term misinformation, you hear it a lot. It's obviously, it's a real thing. It's a buzzword, but I get frustrated sometimes at the limits of that word, and the sort of the way that it loses a little bit of its definition from being used so much and becoming like a political football. And I was trying to get at the idea that, what we're seeing here almost goes a little bit beyond that word. And we tend to use misinformation and have its definition sort of revolve around this idea of persuasion, right? That there's all these people out there that are just being duped by these folks who are like spreading conspiracy theories and they're believing it. And I think that actually is almost a little bit insulting to some of the people who are amplifying and spreading these narratives, because I think that there's a form of agency that needs to be assigned here. There's this researcher who I quote in the piece. His name is Michael Caulfield. He's at the University of Washington. And he has this great way of kind of reframing the definition of misinformation, not as a tool of persuasion, but as a tool of, it's almost like inoculating people from having to reckon with their own false beliefs, right? It's something that actually keeps you within the confines of a particular ideology and makes it so that you don't have to, have the trauma of changing your belief system when confronted with new information. it doesn't always work for us to just assume that there's all these people out there being duped by puppet masters. There's an element of that, sure. But I also think it only speaks to part of the problem. It's a supply problem and a demand problem.
Yeah. Natasha, does the debate online discourse feel fundamentally different to you now?
I mean, I would say that the voices that are elevated and the voices that want to participate are fundamentally different. And, a lot of it, I think, is a reaction to the environment we saw around 2017, 2016, 2015, when some of the people who had less institutional power, but were using the social networks the way that they were pitched, right? Like to elevate voices that otherwise wouldn't be heard. I think a lot of those voices have dropped out of online discourse.
How much is that an Elon Musk issue, and how much of it is a broader changes to our digital infrastructure?
I would argue that no. I mean, I think that that's definitely not a positive development, right? The fact that moderation has completely disappeared from Twitter and that it feels even more like a cesspool now than it did previously. But I would argue that one of the fundamental drivers of this is a balkanization of channels of communication. I was talking to a very prominent venture capitalist about a month ago, and he was saying, well, the new Twitter is private WhatsApp groups, right? And he showed me his phone, and he went through, and he belongs to about 50 or 60 WhatsApp groups, and each of them have 200 to 300 members. And it's very curated and it's very selected, and they have the same kinds of conversations that you used to have on Twitter. The difference being that it's not being done in public, and that those 200 to 300 people who are in your group tend to be somehow aligned with you, right? You tend to have similar worldviews, you work in similar industries, there's fewer dissenting voices, or the dissent is more structured in a way that everyone anticipates and is comfortable with. And so I would argue that what's happened is that social media itself has become much less popular and has given way to bespoke small groups where people have conversations. And there's no transparency, and there's very little ideological diversity in those beyond that which is welcomed.
I would argue that there's a lot of things happening at once. I think that the balkanization is a very real thing, especially in elite spheres. But I mean, it also happens in non, quote unquote elite spheres with, Discord servers and Telegram groups. I think that there is this chaos of not knowing what other people are doing on the internet in a standardized way. I think that that's definitely very vexing for people who do what we do in the media. But I also think that there's a lot happening in big broadcast channels as well. The network that almost never gets, mentioned is YouTube, right? And YouTube is just television, and it's mass media in the way that television is for so many people, and not just Gen Z, just people. And I do think that's something that does feel different, at least to me, about this election cycle, is this idea that it's very hard to pin down where people are getting their information or to some degree, what is popular, right? And that is I think, a fundamental issue that the campaigns have tried to navigate. And it's why you see this idea of picking off different podcast audiences, because it's a little bit yeah, Joe Rogan could be the most, influential and popular interviewer and media personality in this election cycle. He also could not be. It could be, somebody with a, different YouTube channel, or it's nobody. And it's just, you have to do that buckshot, scattershot approach in order to cover all your bases, because nobody knows what's going on.
To build on that, I think one of the ways that I think about it is that the Venn diagrams don't overlap very much these days. And there was a time when we talked about mass media, what we were really talking about is very overlapping Venn diagrams, right? I might be a Republican, but I also watch the nightly news, and you're a Democrat and you watch the nightly news, and we both read the Washington Post and the Atlantic. But now we don't know where the Venn diagrams do overlap. It's very hard to judge. And so as a result, you have to jump into every circle and try and get your message across.
Natasha, you mentioned the masks off moment earlier, and I think some of that is centered within the venture capital community. I wonder if you could walk through a bit of that arc for me. And I'm thinking here of people like Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz, who are two of the biggest VCs in Silicon Valley. Can you tell us about the arc of their ideological transformation over the past year?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, Mark Andreessen penned this very I don't know how to describe it. This manifesto, this techno Optimist Manifesto, and a lot of it was centered around AI, and they were very
Describe a bit what it said, because it was quite striking.
I think it was like, I think you need to think about the incentives for venture capitalists, right? And they need to, in some ways, kind of capture the imagination of the next generation of young people. And they need you to want to take their money rather than someone else's money. So I think it was a big bid to the contingent of the AI community that defines themselves as accelerationists, like a little bit more wanting unbridled progress, kind of leaning into the idea of artificial intelligence as superior intelligence in a way. And so I think it was just like trying to cultivate clout with those shit posters.
So fast forward to this summer then, and how does that evolve into them recording that hour-long podcast launching their support for Trump?
Yeah, if you go back to that time period, it also was like, it's them betting on the perceived winner, right? Like this is after the assassination attempt on Trump. Elon endorses Trump within, I don't know, a couple hours or something. And they have already made their views on the Biden administration very clear. And as Charles said, like, hatred is not too strong a word to describe the way that the tech industry feels about how they have been treated at the hands of Gary Gensler, Lena Khan, Elizabeth Warren, et cetera. So, they are trying, I think, to position themselves as a leader in this new firmament, right? Like this new group of people who aren't afraid to do things that are that would have been politically unpopular within the tech industry, and speak to a different crowd of people.
Yeah, and then Ben Horowitz turns a little bit, right? Like he's weakening his support. Is that also just opportunistic, seeing the tides turn again, or did he get too much heat, or what? Just to put a bow on this narrative, what happened there?
Well, I think that the Harris campaign has been making a lot of overtures to the tech community. I don't think that the Biden administration perhaps realized the extent of the animus that they've been feeling from tech elites, but the Harris campaign very much did, and they've been sending out their delegates, Tony West, Mark Cuban, Reid Hoffman, and others. Okay, now we're back to games as usual and hedging. So,
Charlie, does this matter? Like, does it matter what 20 VCs do in this space? Like, is that consequential to this election?
So, I don't know if it matters from a cultural perspective as much. Obviously, the money matters.
Well, let's talk more about some of that money and influence. And Charles has mentioned a few times, you've spent 6 months looking into kind of the structural elements of that money and how it's flooding into the formal lobbying world via super PACs. Can you paint the picture of how tech money has entered formally into American politics in this election?
Sure, of course. One way of framing this question of why tech money is flowing into PACs is Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz like to be seen as being powerful. They basically have built their brand on convincing entrepreneurs that they're powerful and therefore they should take their dollars instead of other people's dollars. And this is an extension of that for not only Andreessen and Horowitz, but for the Valley to begin to flex their muscle. And so what happened was a couple of years ago, as it became clear that Gary Gensler's SEC was going to begin suing aggressively the crypto industry, Coinbase, one of the largest cryptocurrency companies, exchanges, reached out to a guy named Chris Lehane and asked Chris to come advise them. And Chris is a political specialist. He worked in the Clinton White House. He was the press secretary for Gore's campaign. He knows how to run campaigns. And he came in and he said, look, there's a couple of things we can do. The first is that we want to prove that there's a crypto voter. Whether a crypto voter actually exists or not is open for debate, but we're going to prove that there is a crypto voter because that way we know politicians will listen to us. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to threaten them where it hurts the most, re-election. And in order to do that, we are going to take insane amounts of money and we are going to spend it in ways that creates a spectacle.
What does insane mean? How big was this investment?
So the super PAC that they have funded, which is named Fair Shake, and this is just out of the crypto industry, has raised over $170 million so far, and they've spent about $100 million. And that's not a huge number, but it's actually a very big number in the terms of politics. And more importantly is the way that they've spent it. Katie Porter was running for Senate here in California. And they came in less than 3 weeks before the election and said, we're going to spend $10 million essentially overnight just attacking you mercilessly. And it worked. It's one of the things that caused her to lose that primary. And the message there isn't just, we can beat you. It's, even if we don't beat you, we're going to make your life so unpleasant. We are going to find a candidate and we're going to fund them. And you're going to spend so much time raising money and fighting back and just being on the defense that you should come over to our side. That's how they use money.
Is the fact that both the Harris campaign, or the perception that both the Harris campaign and Trump campaign are fairly pro-crypto right now, is that a reaction to the threat or the opportunity of the crypto voter?
Well, for Donald Trump, it's clearly the opportunity. It's not just the opportunity of the crypto voter. Donald Trump loves anything that makes him money. Yeah. And
right.
so, he used to say that Bitcoin was a scam. And then as soon as he left office, he started selling NFTs and made it $7 million. And he was like, this is okay. I'm on board. He's now the top crypto advocate, I think is his title, of a new cryptocurrency company. So I would say for Donald Trump, he sees an opportunity. He sees an audience that he can talk to. They're an audience who gets super passionate. For the Harris campaign, it's a little bit different. And it's important to note, the Harris campaign has not actually said anything that's overly pro-crypto, right? In fact, Ben Horowitz in his letter saying he's giving money to Harris mentioned this, that they haven't made any policy statements about what they're going to do if they come to power, but they do have conversations. They do signal that they're part of the same camp. They're not making any promises, but like any good politician, they're not alienating this community for no reason.
Can I just say something about the crypto voter? So I think as Charles's piece, which was so good, really demonstrated there is no crypto voter. That was a figment of their imagination. But I think, and it's true, we haven't seen policy moves for her, but I think, her line elevating crypto and blockchain in the same sentence as artificial intelligence and quantum computing, or, Harris's agenda about how to empower Black men. It mentioned crypto as a way of building generational wealth. I mean, those are not subtle signals, or at least I think that they've really meant a lot to the tech community to see that she's willing to listen, to play ball, to adapt.
The other thing that's happened this year, and there was a lot of talk through this year about the 50 global democratic elections happening right at a time when we're seeing leaps in AI capacity and capabilities. Charlie, how has that played out at all in this election? And have you seen some of the fears that we were concerned about around synthetic media or automated accounts or deepfakes play out or not?
I think one thing that's been really interesting about the predictions for this cycle versus what we've seen so far, with the caveat that it is certainly not election day by any stretch yet, or the contentious, interregnum between election day and certification and all that great stuff that we have to think about.
Which could go on for a while.
Yeah, I mean, it's like election, month, election season. I think what's interesting is that a lot of those fears haven't come to pass. I always think when we are evaluating, and we being like people who do what I do and are trying to think about these like broad trends, a lot of people make the mistake of looking at, each cycle through the lens of the old one, right? And I think the deepfake conversation a little bit has sort of followed that, right? A lot of people saying like, what if there is the big thing, that some deep fake of a political candidate, at the wrong time that convinces a bunch of quote unquote, I hate the term, but like low information voters to act a certain way, and I think what we've seen so far is there really hasn't been a lot of that. There was a generative AI voice faked robocall in the New Hampshire primary that really didn't sway anyone, but was sort of this like proof of concept. You have seen some things globally, some generative AI, deepfake style campaigns. It's unclear what the effect is of all of that. But what I would say, broadly speaking, is it's actually very easy in elections to have like a coherent narrative and to understand the truth around something, right? Like when Donald Trump, when there was the attempted assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, it was very clear almost immediately what had happened, like within a few minutes, right? And there wasn't this like parade of deepfakes around it. Were there conspiracies? Like, absolutely. But the broad narrative of somebody tried to shoot the president, he's okay, he stood up, he's been escorted off, that type of thing was actually determined pretty quickly because it's such a mass attentional event, right? So there's a way in which some of these, deep faked things, when everyone is watching and paying attention to one thing, it's a lot harder to sow that kind of distrust and doubt. But where I do think generative AI is playing a role is in like what we're calling AI slop, right? Which is like these very quickly generated, cheap, images or videos or what have you. And I think that the way to think about them, and I've written a little about this, is as just propaganda, right? It's quickly spun up propaganda. It's engagement bait. It is, again, we saw them with the recent hurricanes, people, ginning up some fake images to, signify something that maybe didn't quite happen, but they believe happened. But also you just see it's sort of become like the political aesthetic of the far right. Like on X, it's extremely popular to say something like Kamala Harris is a communist, and then have whatever Dolly or Midjourney like gin up this photo of Kamala with the hammer and sickle, and it's like it's just in some way this like very kind of low rent way to illustrate this thing in order to hopefully like grease the algorithmic skids and get the post more views. But that's the way that I see this stuff. Like, it's this idea of the internet being like flooded with crap more so than the idea of like mass persuasion tools that are duping all kinds of people.
Can I ask a question? Because I actually don't know where I stand on this. I think I kind of know what happens in the tech world if Harris wins, right? It's not going to be a huge change. But if Trump wins, what happens in the tech industry and what happens online? Like 1 year into the Trump administration, have things changed a lot online?
A slight, I'll try to answer it, but a slight like medium term dodge is I think actually the wilder thing is, again, the thing that I'm thinking about the most maybe is this like interregnum period. And it's this idea of like, no matter what happens on election night, Donald Trump is going to most likely, unless it's a absolute trouncing, which it looks like a tight race, he's going to get up there and say he won, and that will become, a far right talking point. And if it is true that Harris wins, then I think the internet, at least like the social media elements or the propaganda elements, I think they change quite a bit. I think it gets really, really bad. If we're talking about the tech industry in general, in a Donald Trump win, I really don't know, because I feel like I always have no idea what it is that he wants or cares about, right? Because like in the same way that we're talking about him as like a crypto advocate, he's not, like he doesn't know what it is. Like if we're just being really honest, like he doesn't know what it is other than a get rich quick scheme. And so I think that there's a lot of confusion. Like he seems to hate Mark Zuckerberg and a lot of these tech execs. But I think that's also just because it plays really well with censorship, and he thinks that they're the reason why.
Well, and he hated Musk too until he endorsed him, and then he flipped pretty quickly, right?
Right. So I think it's just, I think actually a good way then maybe to flip it is like, what happens to the rest of the tech execs who are not pandering to Trump if Trump wins, right? What do they do? Do they follow the Elon Musk playbook or the Andreessen playbook? I don't know, but I can certainly see a number of people, potentially going over that way.
Yeah. Just to close here, Canada is likely to have an election in the coming months. Anything we can learn from what's this relationship between the tech sector and the American election?
Well, Canadian politics seems much more pleasant. I think in large part because it's a parliamentary system, it takes a little bit of the of the stress out of the system, but I know that there's still
a lot less money in the system.
There's a lot less money. I know that there's still been some really divisive races. And, you know, I think one of the things that I'll be curious to watch as I watch the Canadian election is how much of the decisions that a national leader makes now are in reference to international things beyond their control. The fact that Canada has been so critical of India lately and cut off relations because of the attempted Sikh assassination is a great example, right, of an issue that is essentially an international issue seen through a Canadian lens. And these companies, these tech companies, are now international nation states, right? They have as many customers and as many interests and as many obligations to other places as they do to the US or to Canada or to North America. And so I think one of the things I'm going to be really curious to watch is how much of the Canadian race becomes about international issues as opposed to simply national issues.
Any last thoughts, Charlie and Tasha? What can we learn from what you guys have just been in the middle of?
I think it's going to suck regardless. Like, I just like elections are horrible, like everywhere. It doesn't really matter. In part because I think, you know, we have built this sort of information infrastructure that just like it's a grind, man. It's
we're
like
just as embedded in it as you
it's tough
are.
to peruse. Yeah, like no one can escape it. So sorry.
No. Natasha, last word to you.
Yeah, I think that we've been talking this whole time about just a sector of business, right? That's like operating like any other entrenched business interest. And I think we're getting over this like reality distortion field where for a while, like venture capitalists, founders were treated like these philosopher kings. And, you know, we're not talking about like what they're doing that's good for the internet users, good for the customers, good for the country. So I think it's, I guess, like, look at who your politicians are listening to for advice on policies that will affect you, because the stuff they make affects so many of us. But yeah, I just feel like if you go through the whole conversation, it's just been about their how does it benefit them?
It's way better than my answer.
Well, thanks everybody. That was fabulous, and good luck over the next few weeks and in the that long multi-month process.
Oh,
that's
God.
like
Yeah, Charlie, you're giving me nightmares.
Yeah.
It's the great. I'm calling it the great clenching. Right?
Oh my
That's just
God,
like what it is. It's just like
that makes
that's our take. We will clench with you. How about that?
It's really nice to see you guys.
Thanks everybody.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
Machines Like Us is produced by Paradigms in collaboration with the Globe and Mail. The show is produced by Trish Kozika. Our associate producer is Sequoia Kim. Our senior producer is Mitchell Stewart. Our theme song is by Chris Kelly. The president of Paradigms is James Millward. Special thanks to Catherine Gretzinger, Matt Frainer, and the team at the Globe and Mail. If you like the interview you just heard, please subscribe and leave a rating or a comment. It really helps us get the show out to as many people as possible.